Okay. Okay. We're going to jump right into it. This is a pretty fun topic. Honestly, my experience in the first 3 weeks of camp is that it's been better than expected. It's kind of different in terms of its initial structure than last year's topic. For most of you that debated last year, you probably had to learn a lot of new, very technical information about patents and copyright and trademarks. Honestly, that topic lecture kind of wrote itself because you basically had to do an introduction to a very complicated area of law that people get paid millions of dollars for mastering. This topic does not give us as much of a context for what its terms mean, and there's significant ambiguity. So we're going to basically divide this up into 6 parts. We're going to initially just kind of define the area that we're talking about, the Arctic. We're going to talk about areas of Arctic activity, and basically why the Arctic is important and the basic setup for advantages and DAs. We're going to do basically the only terms we have to work with for topicality. We're going to talk extensively about how we could maybe define what development or exploration means. In truth, to be honest, it's probably not going to be extremely successful to narrow down anything, and so this topic will probably just feel like the US doing anything in the Arctic over the course of the year. But there's definitely a lot of potential for narrowing its scope. We're going to define this term ITS, which is going to be incredibly impactful, just determining whether or not the private sector or international actors can be involved. And then we're going to talk about just af and net ground. Okay, so the Arctic, and there's going to be a bunch of maps, so kind of get used to it. If you don't know the geography of the Arctic, you should definitely ensure that you have a basic mental image of what's going on by the end of the summer. There's not one definition. It is derived from an ancient Greek word, Arctikos, meaning the land of the north, and so it is at its most basic the high north, the areas above the line of latitude known as the Arctic Circle. It is named after a constellation that is basically the North Star, also known as the Big Dipper or Ursa Major. Now, there's a lot of potential definitions, and they actually do kind of matter, even though the differences seem narrow. So I like definitions that come from US policy. The topic says United States federal government. So when you're looking for context clues for what would be the most predictable and reasonable way to define a topic, it seems like if the very actor of the resolution has a formal definition of the term, that might take priority. And the US has formally defined the Arctic since 1984. Specifically, we've defined the Arctic as all US and foreign territory north of the Arctic Circle and north and west of the boundary bounded by the Porcupine, Yukon, and Kuskokwim rivers. All contiguous seas, including the Arctic Ocean and Beaufort, Bering, and Chukchi seas, and the Aleutian chain. So just in terms of what those areas look like and exactly why this is impactful, the Aleutian chain is these islands right here. This is the far south of Alaska, and they form a crest on an ocean ridge that goes pretty much all the way to Russia. This kind of locks out the Arctic Ocean from the Pacific. It's a kind of strange definition because you'll notice this is way farther south than any of this stuff here. Most of Alaska's big cities are excluded from this. Anchorage, like right around here. In fact, Alaska goes all the way down this way, and it's not even on the map, and that's like where Juneau and Skagway and a lot of the other big cities in Alaska are. So the Arctic is just this part of Alaska that's north of these rivers according to US code. This will be important. One of the asks that's already been put out is on this island right here. It's about an ADAC air and naval base, and so whether or not the Aleutians is in Alaska determines whether or not that's topical. Whether or not this stuff, all of this, what's called oceanic tundra is included, is important for resources asks. And so this is the US definition. For debate, to be honest, it's very convenient because it pretty much allows in most asks, although there are alternative definitions. This one is important. This is probably the next most important. This is the Arctic Human Development Report definition. So there's been 2 of these, one in like mid-2000s, one in the mid-2010s. It's just called the Arctic Human Development Report. One of the reasons this is kind of good for the topic is just because you use the term development, which also appears in the topic. So maybe that's another context clue that would make this rise above alternative definitions. This one says that when identifying the Arctic, we have all of Alaska. So the southern 2/3 here, that's excluded from most definitions of the Arctic. This one says the Arctic is all of Alaska. So if you're an AF, like for example, one of the starter pack ones we put out here that gives climate adaptation funding to Native American communities, you basically couldn't solve 2/3 of your AF if this is the correct definition and your plan just goes to the Arctic, but you could if this was the definition. So this is another common one, and most of the tea debates that have happened so far about what the Arctic means are comparing this definition and this one. That being said, there are others. Most of these definitions have no scientific basis. They're basically political in nature. They're defined by international organizations or governments in order to basically make sense of policy or be useful in a report. So some people are like, well, okay, everybody's going to have a different point of view or incentive when trying to define the Arctic. Maybe something more neutral is important. So this map is upside down from a traditional perspective in that south is up and north is at the bottom. If you'll notice, this is the part that's like Alaska. And so in this definition, not only do we exclude the Aleutians, we also exclude pretty much any habitable part of Alaska. This is probably the most common scientific definition. It's called above the tree line. The tree line is literally what it sounds like. The Arctic gets so cold that there's actually just kind of an area where trees can grow, and then you keep on going north, and it gets sufficiently cold that and it actually looks like a forest that just stops and is replaced by barren tundra. The trees can no longer grow. And so the tree line is just determined by climatic conditions. Generally speaking, the tree line is where mean temperatures are below 10 to 12 degrees Celsius throughout July. That'll be determining whether or not you have trees. And the term tundra just means the part of the Arctic or the part of any polar region where there are sufficient conditions that trees cannot grow. Naturally, the Aleutians isn't included in this, and this definitely has scientific merit. I think this specific map was designed by a biodiversity organization that's like concerned about, polar bears and maintaining conditions for flora and fauna in the Arctic. There are still other ones. There's another one that's kind of similar called the 10-degree isotherm definition. Almost every international organization that works with the Arctic will have some definition. I think these are the main ones, and obviously, we're talking about sort of edge cases or degrees here. It's basically just the far north of the world close to the Arctic Circle. We talk about a couple of the apps that it impacts. There will be some bad T definitions, and there's even one or two cards in the starter pack that you could use to set this up that will say something kind of ridiculous, okay, there are two definitions that I think will be run throughout the year, but we're not going to win very many rounds unless they're really badly handled. One is that the Arctic is only the land and excludes air, sea, stuff like that. And then another one is that in the US, the Arctic is only Alaska. And so if you want to go in international waters, if you want to go with the other parts of the other countries in the Arctic, then you're out of luck. But to be honest, both of those definitions are really stretched as borderline out of context, and so I don't think they're particularly credible. Okay.
Kevin, a second. Elaine Yates. Okay, in a second. Thank you.
Okay, so the Arctic has about 4 million people who live there. It is roughly half of 1% of the world's population. It is roughly half Russia in terms of population, and about a quarter of all people in the Arctic in any country are of indigenous descent. Inuit, Eskimo, Chukchi, Native Siberian. There are some definitions that will stretch farther into Alaska and then count up to 10 million people, but generally we're talking about a part of the world that, has fewer people in an area the size of the geographical US or larger, depending on exactly how you measure it, that has fewer people in it than many of the cities that you all live in. There are 8 countries that potentially have territory in the Arctic. This definition would have all 8 of them, but this definition would not. And these will come up over and over again. We have the US, because Alaska, Russia, Canada, Iceland, Denmark, because of Greenland, the big island in the Arctic, and then Norway, Sweden, and Finland. But Sweden and Finland are excluded from some definitions, but they're still pretty close. It's a crazy place, geographically speaking. I've been there a couple of times now, including a cruise last summer that was pretty awesome. I mean, it's very memorable, very beautiful. In the summer, if you get into the Arctic Circle, one of the other defining characteristics is that there will be a day of the midnight sun, which means because the days are so extreme, you have a 24-hour period where the sun never sets at the summer solstice. And then you similarly have the northern lights, like these, the aurora borealis, these kind of crazy astrological phenomena that create green and blue flashing streaks in the sky. It's an interesting place. We're going to watch a video. I mean, it's actually hard to picture this if you haven't, seen it. And so kind of describing it only does so much. And I think this gives pretty good background and context.
Like in September 1984.
Can you all hear?
Fast forward 32 years, and this is what it looks like. September 2016. Most of the world sees this as a looming disaster. But for the Arctic nations, this change means an opportunity. Access to a brand new ocean. Here's what geologists think oil and gas resources might look like in the Arctic. The U.S. Geological Survey estimates that the region holds 30% of the world's undiscovered natural gas and 13% of its oil. These resources are still remote and costly to access, but they're more accessible every year, and suddenly this desolate region is very interesting to the world. New shipping routes are also opening up. And this ocean that was once frozen is now navigable for longer periods every summer, cutting weeks off the trips between Asian and Western markets. The topic of borders in the Arctic region is a little bit complex, and it's an issue that's still open for discussion and negotiation. Currently, the border lines in the Arctic Ocean look like this. Every country gets their default maritime borders that are 200 nautical miles off their coast. The rest of the water that doesn't fall within these exclusive economic zones is up for grabs to anyone who can prove that it belongs to them. And that has a lot to do with a continental shelf. A continental shelf is a part of a country's landmass. It's just covered with ocean. The continental shelf continues until it drops off into the deeper parts of the ocean. Since the ice has been melting, countries have been sending out submarines to gather data on their continental shelf. They put together a scientific case and submit it to a UN committee. This committee reviews it and decides whether or not the country's claim is scientifically valid.
Extending from our coastlines, lying beneath the sea, is an extension of our country called the continental shelf. It determines the new borders of our country. Knowing where the edge of the continental shelf lies adds millions of square kilometers to our country and makes the resources on the seafloor and beneath the seabed Canada's.
So far, Norway and Iceland are the only two nations whose continental shelf claims have been submitted and approved by the UN. But others have submitted claims that are waiting for approval. Look at Russia's claims versus that of Greenland, the large Arctic island that actually belongs to Denmark. The claims overlap significantly. Canada is in the process of gathering data and is expected to submit a claim that will also have some overlap here. The UN committee that evaluates these claims is made up of scientists, not diplomats. Their sole job is to say whether or not the claim is scientifically valid. It's then up to the countries to negotiate how to work out who gets what. Russia has shown its interest in having a claim that extends all the way to the North Pole.
In 2007, Russia went so far as to plant its flag on the seafloor under the North Pole.
And if push comes to shove, Russia likely won't concede its North Pole claim to the tiny nation of Denmark, whose claims overlap with theirs. Russia is easily the biggest player in the Arctic neighborhood. Half of the Arctic is flanked by Russian coast, and they easily wield the most influence, and they have the most to gain from global warming and the ice melting. And so they're refortifying and renovating a lot of their strategic outposts here in the Arctic.
50 airfields by 2020, putting special forces, their training, holding military exercises in the Arctic.
In recent years, Russia has been reopening, fortifying, and building new military bases in the Arctic region. They've been publicizing their military exercises, which include reindeer, huskies, and soldiers in uniforms that look like they belong in a Star Wars film.
Russia is sending us important signals that in the Arctic, they will project their own power and capabilities. And I don't see a sufficient response from the US and NATO to recognize that increased military position.
One of those outposts is the town.
Okay. So hopefully that gives a little bit of context and you could picture what we're talking about. So part 2 is going to go over basically the areas of Arctic activity. And these are the significant aspects of the Arctic that motivate people to write about it, to care about it, and that to really anticipate what people are going to discuss on this topic, you need to have a basic background for. We'll kind of go over all of these individually, so I'm not going to go kind of through all of them right now. But the first, and this is going to cover a few of the major advantages, is the economic value of the Arctic. I guess maybe one of these I won't mention afterwards is tourism, which is probably a huge industry in the Arctic. But the most important commercial activity that's happened in the Arctic has long been energy and mining. So historically, a huge percentage of fossil fuels, especially in the last 20 years as more unconventional deposits have been available, come from the Arctic. In 2008, the United States Geological Survey estimated that the Arctic had as much oil as the United Arab Emirates and as much natural gas as Russia, who are two of the dominant players in both of those. As polar ice caps are melting, there's potentially more and more fossil fuel deposits that were previously not commercially viable. And it also will be easier to access them because you might be able to actually sail a ship there that's not blocked by ice. And they're melting glaciers. One thing I wish the video had that is also useful to picture. I think a lot of times when we talk about a glacier, we might just picture, almost like an ice rink, just kind of like ice on the ground. In reality, a glacier is more like a giant ice cliff. They're over a mile high. Like you'll be walking on barren tundra, and then a glacier starts, and it's literally just an actual wall of ice that, it looks like a mountain. And it just goes kind of on forever. And I guess from the top of the glacier, it might look more like that ice rink. But when we talk about a glacier melting, we're talking about huge amounts of ice. And when we're talking about a glacier or like an icebreaker that breaks through it, this is an insane amount of material. Like this is very, very, very high volume water. Now, another area of potential mineral exploration that is not as much historical, but very much recent and current. A lot of people think that many of the minerals that are vital for electronic vehicles, especially the batteries that are used for them, as well as some semiconductors, can be found in the Arctic. Zinc, bauxite, which is the major ingredient in aluminum, palladium, and nickel are probably the 4 that have huge deposits in the Arctic. And then there are other things that, of course, people like gold. So all of these are potentially in the Arctic, but because of all of this ice, because of how far it is, because of how difficult it is to get there, it's maybe not commercially viable to get a lot of it yet. Okay, so a huge potential set of changes that is happening to the Arctic involves shipping. And so you'll see these over and over again in many files. There's another map of them on the next page if this one is not totally doing it for you. But we have the Northwest Passage and then the NSR, or the Northern Sea Route. So both of these are basically hypothetical. The vast majority of ships do not really sail them now. But in the future, it is potentially viable that if the ice melts and ships can get through that, you can really reduce the overall time it takes to ship most goods in the world, and you'd avoid some of the areas that potentially could close down. So, I mean, there's actually a few problems with this kind of narrative. I actually think it's probably wrong, which we'll get to in a second. But in terms of explaining why this matters, I mean, a lot of people just don't realize everything that you have, even with you right now, certainly your laptops, but even your clothes, your water bottles, all of that is made by dozens to hundreds of discrete individual materials that are shipped across the world in container boxes on cargo ships to produce pretty much everything we have. We have a globalized supply chain that has so much complexity to it, it's almost unfathomable to understand. And so there's a lot at stake here. If this changed, basically like everything that you own would ultimately be created via a different geographical route if this was a potential sea route. So people really do care about the potential here. Here's another map. One thing you'll notice about a lot of these is that they center around the North Pole. So here we have the North Pole, all directions are south from it. And the size of everything from this perspective is a little bit different than you're probably used to. Greenland still looks pretty big here, but it's still significantly smaller than it is on Mercator projections, which were the kind of flat maps we're used to seeing. So here we have America, right? Here are the Great Lakes. You can see Michigan kind of right here. The Northwest Passage, which is what motivated a lot of the initial exploration of America to begin with, the idea that you can get from the Atlantic to the Pacific, would go up through here, up through the Hudson Bay, and around Alaska. Again, this is maybe sometimes accessible for like 2 months during the summer, but for the vast majority of the year, and really even then it's not very popular, you can't sail this. This is the potential northern sea route, the NSR, that Russia would love to have, that goes along the entire length of Siberia. And so you could cut across from the Atlantic to the Pacific that way as well. I mean, the day that the camp started was the day that the US struck Iran's nuclear facilities, and so it kind of makes it, I think, obvious why, and obviously in response to that, people theorized that Iran might close the Strait of Hormuz, which is the major chokehold on shipping in the world. And so people could understand, I think, pretty easily why, if there was a close down in global shipping, having an alternative might be the difference between avoiding a major economic decline or not. We'll go over this in 1 second. Just quick thing about shipping, really quick. The reason why the shipping argument is like kind of bad, or at least premature, is that, well, I'll put it this way. So in the last 30 years, the average cargo ship, you know, the things that are carrying everything, the average speed of a cargo ship has declined. It has become more profitable to sail a cargo ship at 12 knots, or roughly 12 miles an hour, close to it, than it is to sail it at 30 miles an hour, or 30 knots, which is what it was sailing in the 70s and 80s. Could anyone guess, or maybe you just know, why would this be true? Yeah. That's a good guess. It's not it, though. It's maybe a little bit more efficient, but not so much that, I mean, if you just imagine, you could cover 3 times as much ground. So you'd have to have a huge difference in fuel efficiency to make up for that. But that was a good guess. But it's not. Yep. What's that? They have been getting bigger, but that's not it. The bigger ships could potentially be rigged to go much faster and cover much more ground.
Companies can charge to make the shipping faster, so you get a from that.
Yeah, it's like a video game where they just charge you for everything good. No, that's not exactly it either, but I certainly wouldn't put it past them. No, the reason is because, like I was saying about the complexity of the global supply chain, everything is so meticulously organized that these things are scheduled out to basically the minute, months in advance. We have what's called just-in-time shipping, which means literally the ship gets there just in time to get unloaded and meet the next schedule, because we just have thousands and thousands of connections happening around the world every day. And so if you are doing this kind of thing, where you are operating on very thin time margins, what is the worst thing that could happen? You fall behind schedule. Now, the Arctic is a place where you can notoriously fall behind schedule. There's giant floating icebergs everywhere. There's no infrastructure. There's nothing around you. There's crazy, unpredictable weather. And so the Arctic is not a very good place to have reliable shipping schedules. People have realized that if you just kind of play it slow, slow and steady wins the race, you actually literally make more money, because you can ultimately ship way, way more if you're just on time and keep a tight schedule. So it is unlikely to me that unless there is like a major chokehold closure, like either the Straits of Malacca or Hormuz are closed, that we're going to see a lot of short-term Arctic shipping. But some people disagree with that, and in the distant future, you could maybe see this as a possibility. So this is sort of a background phenomena that undergirds everything happening to the Arctic, and that most authors kind of write about. The Arctic is by far, along with Antarctica, the most significant current impact of global warming is happening in the Arctic. It is disproportionately affecting the poles. And so you could see just over the course of the last 30 years, the median sea ice, like winter to summer, the ice will kind of expand and contract. But the average point to where it expands and contracts to has gone from this little red line here to this green line around it. And so that is hundreds of miles of average sea ice that is contracted and will continue to contract. The glaciers are getting smaller, and more, especially summers, open water is opening up. There are other economic things about the Arctic that could be important, fishing, but those are probably the two most important, minerals and shipping. Okay, the next area of Arctic concern is geopolitical and security concerns. So, like we said, there's 8 countries in the Arctic. For a long time, there has been an idea of Arctic exceptionalism. Does anyone know what that means or what that is? Yeah? Yeah, so despite the fact that a lot of the major players in the Arctic, especially Russia and the US, have been at crosshairs, they've been antagonistic towards one another, the Arctic has been an area where they've cooperated scientifically and where, generally speaking, peaceable relations, even between enemies, have emerged. A lot of contemporary military theorists believe that this is basically ending, and that especially as the sea ice recedes, we're going to see actual military activity that hasn't really characterized the Arctic ever previously. Sometimes this is characterized as, quote, the polar trap, the idea that because nations believe the Arctic is so peaceful, they will actually expose their flanks, they will expose themselves militarily to their adversaries because they don't really see it coming. And as we can see in this map, Russia is building lots and lots of new bases. You also saw that in the video. These are all at least somewhat military bases. A lot of them have some civilian applications as well. Russia potentially really has ambitions to make the Arctic important. Prior to their invasion of Ukraine in 2014, the first one, Russia still did not have a blue water port. That means a port on a city where it is non-ice year-round. They did have some ports in the northern parts of Russia, but in the winter, those ice up, so you can't sail them in the winter. If Russia had more access to a northern sea route, everything they buy, especially as they try to evade US and global sanctions, would be a lot cheaper, and they could especially start shipping things to and from China a lot more economically. As a result, they have by far the biggest fleet of icebreakers, which are pretty much what they sound like. They are absolutely giant ships that exist. They kind of have a V formation at the front, and they break down ice, and they allow ships to sail in their wake. They have nuclear-powered icebreakers. They have 20 to 30. And this isn't just military, this is also commercial, but this is kind of, it seems, what Russia wants to do in the Arctic. China has also declared themselves an Arctic nation. So they're not super close to the Arctic. You can see here the closest point in China proper is 811 miles away. That's still a lot closer than you might think. It's a lot closer than most of Europe, for example. And they have declared themselves an Arctic country, whatever that means. Now, why does China care about the Arctic? I mean, for the same reason they care about anything. There's potential economic interests. They could do scientific research there. It could deepen their relationship with Russia. They could get fishing resources that are important for a population of over 1 billion. And so a lot of geopolitical theorists also fear China. I would say the China deterrence advantage is probably the most common advantage that's been run across after this camp so far. So militarily, what is the US doing in the Arctic? Well, in terms of what we presently have, the most important and written about military installation is NORAD, which is the early warning radar system that uses basically a World War II era technology to detect changes in the atmosphere that portend either missiles or airstrikes by an enemy. The domain awareness concept, sometimes called marine or maritime domain awareness, comes up over and over and over again. Through icebreakers and then also just like having satellites and sensors, we potentially can get a better picture of what's happening in the Arctic. We can see in real time where other countries' ships and planes are. If they were to hypothetically attack us, bless you, they would be able to see that coming ahead of time. We don't have a ton of military bases in the Arctic. We have in terms of military installations, we have over 20, and we have some in Greenland and with other allies as well. But we don't have a lot of permanent Arctic troops, and we don't have a lot of huge military bases. We don't have a lot of major airfields. And so potentially we could expand that. It is worth mentioning that every single one of the Arctic countries besides Russia is in a military alliance with one another, like a mutual defense arrangement, in which if one is attacked, the other has to come to their defense. Finland and Sweden weren't up until a few years ago, but they are now. And then in terms of what the military actually does day to day, the vast majority of actually existing Arctic military operations sort of do things like disaster relief and search and rescue. They help people who are stuck. They help support fishing operations. They help support oil spill cleanup. And a lot of this happens in the US through the Coast Guard, and then through Russia's kind of equivalent of it. Okay, so this area is background on governance and international law for the Arctic, which is important. I think you'll have an entire lecture on this later on. The most important international organization is the Arctic Council. So the Arctic Council, and sorry, this font is kind of small, is something that began in the mid-90s as a forum to discuss environmental issues. It does not do any security or military stuff. Every Arctic country is in it. And for an international organization that basically is just, it's a very small, non-military aspect of all of its component countries, it's had a surprising amount of success. The Arctic Council in the 2010s alone facilitated the establishment of 3 different legally binding agreements that all the Arctic states agreed to. One of them was about how to do search and rescue. One of them was about how to clean up and prevent oil spills, and the other was about just scientific diplomacy and scientific cooperation. But since 2022, the Arctic Council has functioned much less effectively because Russia is barely involved. There are still some meetings, and the chair of the Arctic Council changes every 2 years. It's about to change from Denmark to Sweden. But it's not really doing anything resembling the scale or scope of previous activities. But potentially they can. Some AFs will claim that they should. Other legal stuff, the other probably biggest international law organization involved with the Arctic is the International Maritime Organization, which is a branch of the UN. They regulate shipping. The IMO was created in order to regulate flags of convenience. So the idea here is that if you don't have, you know, it's also kind of interesting to think about if you haven't previously. If you're out at sea, you're all alone, you have like really no support, you have to ultimately, if you're in trouble, get out of it, extract yourself, and then go back and report to your authorities back home and kind of work from that. And so forever on the open seas, if you have something nefarious in your plans, you have every incentive not to tell people where you're from so you can't get punished back at home. As a result, a lot of ships are flagged. They sail the flag of a country that basically does not enforce any rules on the sea and lets them do whatever they want. These are called flags of convenience. And so the IMO was made to establish both incentives and deterrents for countries, for ships to basically not fly flags of convenience. They said, unless you're a country that regulates your activities of your flagged ships at sea, you will face economic disincentives. You will kind of get charged or lose access to shipping activities. And so the IMO does have the most recent international law development in the Arctic. They developed the Polar Code, which basically establishes the rules for what properly flagged ships must do in the Arctic. For some civilian shipping applications, the IMO will come up. IMO credibility will definitely be an advantage right at some point. So it's good to at least recognize that term. Area 4 was climate and environment. So this is something that is extensively written about in the Arctic context. Almost everybody mentions that global warming is accelerating all forms of development and change in the Arctic. That being said, outside of maybe a couple of AFs, warming is not a very good AF advantage because for the most part, you can't do all that much in the Arctic alone. Like warming is changing the Arctic, but that doesn't mean that the Arctic by itself has enough potential, if you like change their energy usage, to solve global warming. So a lot of times AFs will be like, because global warming is causing ice to melt, or because global warming is causing XYZ, we should, and then kind of find a solution to the problem in the Arctic. In terms of environmental pollution in the past, the most significant has been oil spills. Oil spill cleanup and prevention is a huge part of it. If you are going to solve global warming, there are basically two AFs, or two sets of AFs that try to do so. So one that Michigan's already put out two separate AFs for is geoengineering, which is the active human manipulation of climatic systems. Geoengineering is basically a way to say, okay, so we know that carbon emissions cause global warming. Can't solve those, especially because we can't control other countries. So maybe we can just change the atmosphere through active climate manipulation. There are mainly two ways that we can do this. The first is called solar geoengineering, and it is pretty basic in principle. You literally reflect sunlight back into space so that not as much of it is trapped in the Earth's atmosphere, and thus it becomes colder. You can do this basically through building anything that kind of functions as a mirror. The most common proposals are to inject a bunch of white particles into the clouds, like kind of create artificial clouds that block the sunlight, bounce it back into space, and therefore keep the Earth cooler. There are other ways. I mean, there's also, you could put latex, like tiny, like micro latex plastic bubbles in the ocean that has the same reflecting thing, but those are the general ideas for solar geoengineering. The other actually does attempt to change the nature of the carbon dioxide distribution on Earth. That would be sequestration geoengineering. Sequestration geoengineering attempts to create carbon sinks to build artificial trees, build artificial iron stores, phosphate deposits in the ocean or on land that actually trap in carbon dioxide and therefore reduce it. The Arctic, because of its unique location in the Earth and its proximity to basically certain angles of sunlight, is potentially a prime environment for marine cloud brightening. It'd be like the place to do it. So I'm a little skeptical about the actual Arctic key warrants, but there is a claim that this is well suited to the Arctic. The other thing you could do in the Arctic that could maybe have a real impact on global electricity emissions is nuclear power. This app isn't out yet, but one of the juniors labs will soon have an app that has the Department of Defense build small modular reactors, like small nuclear reactors from the next generation of technology on its military bases. About 10 years ago in college on an energy topic, this app was actually ran independently by the two top teams in the country, like number 1 and 2, Arctic DoD SMRs. And so this has had a historical track record in debate as a good app. And then the other, one of the seniors labs just put out a floating nuclear reactors app. So you can kind of build these things too. In terms of other environment stuff that doesn't have to do with energy, there's quite a bit. The biggest organization for doing science stuff in the Arctic is called NOAA, which they're mainly known for doing stuff with oceans, but they also, as a result of that, do a ton in the Arctic. In the Arctic specifically, they get a lot of their understanding of the Earth's currents and atmosphere patterns through satellites and space operations that they keep there. A lot of times it's called Earth observation monitoring. And so a lot of the apps that you could fall under the environment will also kind of fall under that rubric. And then the fifth and final area is what I grouped as indigenous, cultural, and aesthetic values to the Arctic. So already we have a fairly popular climate adaptation app that basically just asks native populations in Alaska what they would like to do to adapt to the climate and then funds it. I mean, if you read about it, there's honestly, like if you just like start Googling stuff about the Arctic in general, like half of the stuff that comes up is about the indigenous populations of the Arctic. This kind of makes sense because the Arctic is not inhabited by all that many people, and a fourth of the people that live there are indigenous, and they've kind of figured out a way to live in what most people find a very inhospitable and difficult terrain. And so they're just kind of the people who care, and the people who are most affected by any developments in the Arctic. And every country has all these different organizations, most of which seem like they don't do all that much, but maybe could do much more. There are other things people like the Arctic for. I mean, the Arctic has some of the most iconic wildlife in the world, you know, polar bears and narwhals. The kind of like wild element of it is something that aesthetically is valuable. And then all of the cultural resources that you'd associate with the indigenous tribes in the Arctic. If they were threatened by climate change or threatened by development, then potentially we would lose quite a lot of value. Okay, so that is going to cover the basic background before we start getting a little bit more technical and into the weeds about tea stuff. I kind of want you to lock in for that. So we're going to take like a 5 to 10 minute break and kind of come back and start getting into what these words mean. Thank you. All right, let's bring it back. Okay, so as I mentioned, and as it probably appeared from how we set up the first part of this lecture, this kind of just feels like a do anything in the Arctic topic, which, if you're negative, kind of leaves you at the behest of the F, and whether or not you have something to say will likely be determined based on whether or not the 1AC has chosen to offer you something to say. So before we kind of discuss potential, albeit problematic ways to limit the topic, we do just want to kind of cover not only does every single one of these activities constitute either a solvency mechanism or an advantage, and this is not exhaustive, the list keeps on going. We have charting and mapping, forecasting, search and rescue, icebreakers, oil spill response, vessel requirements, that was the flags of convenience thing I talked about, communications, like undersea cables or stuff like that, ports, we could dredge them, we can make them better. Not only are all of these, and this is already out in the T file, so you don't need to take a picture of it. Each one of those activities is independently coordinated or ran by a separate government agency. So if NOAA, which is located in the Department of Commerce, is the one that does all of the forecasting or charting, the Army Corps of Engineers, which is part of the DoD, is in charge of ports, basically. The Coast Guard is actually in charge of icebreakers, and the Coast Guard is kind of weird. Coast Guard is like quasi-military, quasi-civilian, but the Coast Guard is actually not in the DoD, they're in the Department of Homeland Security. The Department of the Interior, DOI, specifically the Bureau of Land Management or Ocean Energy Management, determines whether or not you can lease or have a permit to develop mineral resources, oil or natural gas. The Department of State would cooperate with another country. The Department of Transportation would be in charge of doing airport or maritime upgrades. So we have a lot of different parts of the government. There's no trade-off DA links to all of them. Potentially, we have really just a do anything in the Arctic or Alaska topic. There's so many different government organizations. I just included this unreadable chart here because I thought it was hilarious, because this was a chart that was labeled as the simplifying version of how government structures are hierarchically arranged in the Arctic. This is the simple version. And so, yeah, that maybe not the best understanding. So, I mean, I wish they had the complex version. Like, I can only imagine like how many interwoven like spider webs there were. So, what can we do? Okay, so this one, I will warn you, this has already caused a bunch of consternation. I mean, in the Michigan camp files alone, if you've looked at them already, there's like 4 and 5 back and forth files responding to Blake's AF and subsequent neg developments on this issue alone. I think that many would argue, I think incorrectly, but many would argue that I am not a neutral participant in these debates. I'm probably kind of seen as the big T minerals proselytizer, which I think is unfair. So I will admit all of the problems with this, but then I think there are some virtues that maybe are not understood. The basic idea here is that a topical AF has to do mineral development. So that includes all of the oil stuff, natural gas stuff, but also includes rare earth minerals, gold, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so you have to search for it when you explore, and you have to development just means the activities that produce the minerals. Specifically, geophysical activity, drilling, platform construction, and the operation of onshore support facilities. The initial T starter pack file has a US Code 90 card that is from a law about Antarctica. This one is not just about the Arctic, it's about mineral development, but it is about, it explicitly applies to the Arctic. So, first some context on what this setup is. The most important part of why I think T minerals is a reasonable interpretation is that almost every single time in US law, remember the guiding source on whether or not something is most likely a predictable interpretation of the topic, because the topic itself says USFG, the only times you see exploration and development defined together is in a mineral or mining context. Now, development as a term can mean so many things. I mean, just control Fing development in a file, in an article, is usually a waste of time because we have research and development, we have psychological developments, we have just the term developing as a synonym for creating or burgeoning or nascent. Development is used in so many contexts that, first of all, you have to choose some limitation. Development can't mean all of those things. It never is used to describe everything from a developing country to research and development to psychological development. It's never meaning all of those things. So we have to pick something reasonable for it to mean. Now, development in our resolution happens to appear alongside a term that it is often used together with. And every single time you find any statute or piece of legislation that defines both of those terms together, it is almost exclusively in the mining or minerals context. There's 80 other acts. Now, most of the answers to this in the AF part of the files, they'll make the same argument, wow, well, this is not about Alaska, or they're only defining it for the Submerged Lands Act, or they're only defining it for the Outer Continental Shelf, or they're only defining it for one of the other 15 acts that it's used for, which kind of misses the point. Yes, obviously. But it's just when any bill of any sort on any topic happens to define both of these terms together, especially if it's going to apply to the Arctic, it will usually mean exploration and development. So if we're looking for a predictable guess as to how to contextualize those terms, that's as good as anything else. And any counterinterpretation will similarly be imperfect or flawed from a predictability standpoint. Now, the biggest problem with this topic is that it probably sort of sucks. Most of the best AFs in terms of having debate level advantages and defenses against counterplans will include the military. That being said, my lab is turning out a couple of mineral AFs in the next wave, and there's already been quite a few that are at least reasonable. So it's not zero. But admittedly, this is probably not the most fun topic, and it's a little bit more difficult to create arguments for. It's also a useful negative generic for that reason, though. Generally speaking, you'd want to say only resource extraction and mining are allowed, military activity excluded. And like I was saying, admittedly, a lot of the evidence for this does come from specific things where it's clearly defining it for a mining or mineral context, but that's still coming from US Code or Alaskan state law. And again, there's not very many credible alternatives for how we limit this topic, so the alternative is just accepting you can do whatever you want in Alaska. If you extend this argument in the 2NC, I think it's important to emphasize that you're not just basing this off of one random card in one piece of US code. It's that the paired term of defining exploration alongside defining development happens over and over and over again in different areas of US code. And you want to read a few different cards from different sources to establish that, because no one's going to take your word for that unless you read the cards. These are a few examples of cards. I mean, with all the supplements now, there's like 15 cards to choose from that I think are reasonable enough on this. Most of these are good for limiting out development apps, but the best card overall that's, I think, from, so this is an informal opinion, and a few of the cards in the files are like this. Alaska has this nice thing. I love Alaska. It's so small, so like you could just like do this. Like no other state would this be feasible. In Alaska, you could just submit, like you could do it yourself. I actually have submitted one, and I want to see if I gets back to me by the end of the summer. A legal request to the Solicitor General, and the Assistant Attorney General, the number 2 legal person in the state, will get back to you and publish a formal opinion on whether or not just like on what you said. And so a ton of the good T cards from the Alaska context come from these informal opinions offered by the Assistant Attorney General. So it's like pretty publicly accessible. So this one says exploration is a mineral deposit to determine geological surveys, it's feasible to mine. Exploration is undertaken to gain the knowledge, size, shape, position, characteristic, and value of the deposit. There's additional evidence for kind of supporting context. So this actually is even older than 22. I think this kind of text started in 2014 or so. This is from the US's National Security for the Arctic region. One of the things that the Department of State does is they will give out all of our different national approaches or national strategies for different parts of the world. And in the 4-pillar approach defined by Obama in 2014, which both Trump and Biden have basically recycled, the Arctic is developed into 4 pillars. We have development, cooperation, climate change, and security, which would seem to imply that the climate, security, and cooperation parts are all distinct from the development parts. Now, admittedly, the F angle on predictability is pretty good for T minerals, and it's generally what I would advise going for. There is a debatability case as well, but you have a few options for how to counter-define the term development. One option is the term human development. So in the Alaska Human Rights Report that we also look at the map for Alaska from earlier, we have the idea that development is often poorly defined. It's kind of linked to economic goals, stuff like minerals. It's especially criticizing GDP-based definitions of developing for what constitutes a developing country. And then it says human development is basically all of the activities that allow individuals to flourish. And so it's a pretty broad definition, but it is contextualized to Alaska. Doesn't map onto the topic perfectly, because usually it's defining human development, not development. My favorite counterinterpret for the F, by far, is this Alaska Statutes 22 card. Like I said, I think it's more predictable to define from US code, because we're dealing with US policy. And this one, which is in the initial starter pack T file, says that military infrastructure, as well as any other commercial infrastructure development, constitutes it. But the reason this interpretation is better than a lot of the minerals ones is that, admittedly, all the minerals cards are in a mineral context. We're talking about the Submerged Lands Act. We're talking about Alaska statutes or lawsuits about mining. And so they're clearly, minerals are on the mind when they're defining development. This definition comes from the Alaska Infrastructure Development Bank. And so this was actually trying to determine what projects constitute development when a bank was deciding whether or not to fund them. And so they had every incentive to be comprehensive and thorough in just broadly determining what does development in the Arctic mean. And so that's about as good as a kind of contextual and predictable source as you can map onto this topic. One story that one of my co-lab leaders has told several times, Eric Forsland, part of the reason this topic is so hard to define is that it was actually written casually in 15 minutes. So in the topic committee meeting, there was these working groups. They have 15 different papers that they submit, and you get divided, different debate coaches, into groups to deal with paper. Who has read the topic paper before camp? Anyone? Okay, what is the topic paper about? So shout it out. The Arctic Council. The topic paper has nothing to do with the topic that's here. And that's because the Arctic Council topic was so bad and narrowly written that they were like, well, we have to change it. We only have 15 minutes before we have to go to another topic. And so they picked the terms exploration and development because a pretty well-remembered topic from 2014 to 15, the oceans topic, exploration or development of the oceans, had those terms and it wasn't a disaster. And so we just chose those terms with the Arctic with like no cards or betting. It was kind of the best we could do, and then that just happened to win every stage of voting and won. And so here we are. So we aren't dealing with something that was particularly sussed out and vetted. We're trying to do the best we can to infer a reasonable, neutrally accessible, predictable interpretation from basically random words thrown together. So this probably has the closest to whatever that random smorgasbord of words is defined as. So I do like that card a lot. And then, of course, you can just say, like, this definition is kind of bad for debate. To be honest, like, you actually can do drilling or mineral extraction in the Arctic now. I mean, the reason why it's not done is because it wouldn't be economically viable. It's really, really difficult. If you could make money doing it, they already would. So the AF has to, like, do something else to make it somehow cheaper, and then have, like, an Alaska key warrant. It's not the easiest. There is an even more extreme version of T minerals that limits out rare earth metals and minerals and says it's only oil and natural gas. I mean, I guess you could throw that in against a mineral app that uses rare earth minerals, but I wouldn't highly recommend it. There are 3 other definitions of development that I think are useful to understand and be able to go for, and these at least limit out the topic a little bit. The first one is probably the least helpful because you're probably not going to win it. There are cards that say development is non-military. I included like the 1 4-point plan thing before, but this one says that the term development is non-military purposes by governments. Can anyone potentially point to a problem with this card?
It says, quote, developmental aid.
Yeah. Pretty much every card that defines this term as non-military is defining development aid. And if you put in quotes and just like search for Google, development aid and non-military, you will find a lot of hits. That is a common definition. But development aid is not development. Development aid is usually from one country to another, and the whole idea is that it's like trying to distinguish aiding a country's civilian sector versus aiding their military. And so this is not a very good definition, but it's okay. It'll be read because military is actually so common. The next 2 I actually think are somewhat viable. I think development can exclude protection is one of the best definitions on the topic. And I think it's going to be so successful, you almost won't be able to read it because I don't think people will read protection Fs. So, insofar as development means anything, it generally means building up infrastructure, building up economic resources, and stuff like that. If this term is paired with its opposite, the opposite of building up civilian infrastructure or military infrastructure is keeping it wild and pristine. And so in law, there's constantly a dichotomy between development on the one hand and protection on the other. Protection means keeping the environment as it is or preserving it in order to minimize pollution, to allow wildlife or biodiversity to flourish, and stuff like that. And so some of the proposals for what to do with the Arctic, stuff like marine protected areas, which was a popular app on past topics, is literally the opposite of development. It actually bans development. It says you can't develop here because we need to protect the animals or wildlife within it. And so that is something that if your app only says we can't develop, it's kind of not doing development. So some of the proposals for what to do in terms of protecting the environment, I think those can be excluded from development. And then there's another set of arguments about exploration, which say that exploration excludes targeted research and is instead open-ended. So the whole idea of exploration is that you aren't looking for something specific, you're looking for something non-specific, and you're just kind of out there vibing, hoping to find something. But as soon as you specify a target, you are now doing scientific research. You have a hypothesis that you might find or discover something, And you are on a research project, not an exploration project. And so functionally, there's like basically very little to no exploration apps that are possible, because like all you could do is just like go out there and like look for nothing specific. There are some cards for all of these. Here's like the exploration is open-ended stuff. Exploration may be defined as activities that do not produce tangible benefits. Maybe it mixes burdens and just says if you have an advantage, you're not topical. This says you can't have a preconceived notion of what you find. It's distinct from mapping. And these are all in T files that have been out for a while. Okay, so that covers exploration and development. If there are other ways to limit them, they haven't really been proposed or cut yet. Maybe there's something out there, but I actually kind of doubt it. So those are the only limiting devices we have at our disposal. And so in practice, this very likely may just be a do whatever you'd like in the Arctic topic. Okay, before we move on to the other limiting term in the resolution, do we have any questions? No? Okay, T-its. I think there are like maybe 3 different elements at play with T-its. So with T-its, we're really dealing with what does it mean for the US to increase its development? Does that mean you can include the private sector? Well, for T minerals, who actually develops minerals for the most part? The private sector, companies that are for-profit corporations and firms and stuff like that. Does it mean that you can cooperate with other countries? Pretty much every scientific activity that takes place in the Arctic is done via the auspices of the Arctic Council or another international collaboration. Even our military bases. We have more Arctic military bases in our allies' territory, like Thule in Greenland or Kravnvik in Norway, than we have on US territory in Alaska. We have lots and lots of development or exploration that happens with others. And if that's excluded, not only does this mean the AF has way less ground available to it, it also means all of those things become potential counterplans that can set up negative arguments. So the definition of its is a very important one. It is unfortunate that the term its is not really defined in the context of the Arctic. There is stuff that defends, for example, what is federal development in the Arctic, what is federal exploration in the Arctic, but again, this kind of exact phrasing we have in the resolution is not mapped perfectly onto any of the definitions. So the biggest sources of terms that define federal development come from the Coastal Zone Management Act, or the CZMA. And the CZMA does define coast development as basically only military apps being topical, because it says when we do its development, it has to be owned, operated exclusively by the US federal agency who is doing it. So when they define development project, they're like, for a federal development project to be a federal development project, private sector's not involved, it's completely owned and operated by the USFG. And I mean, if you remember from earlier, we had this huge list of potential agencies. So like, that's a lot of agencies that could be involved. But they have to be the ones doing all of this. That being said, let's look at what's topical under that interpretation. Research, weather and climate services, forecasting, probably topical. Ports, probably topical. Resources, not topical. Coast Guard search and rescue missions, icebreaker fleet, probably topical. So a lot of it's still topical, but some of it, including the better Fs, is limited out, and the military ones are probably the most strategic ones remaining. There is probably a predictability issue here. So we'll go through 2 cards. We'll do this one first. So this is just what the card says. Development is defined as follows. A federal development project is a federal activity involving the planning, construction, modification, or removal of public works, facilities, or other structures, and the acquisition, utilization, or disposal of land or water resources. Okay, so I mean, first of all, just the same problem we had with key minerals. Like most of these are defining this for a specific purpose. This is the Coastal Zone Management Act, not all of Alaska. It's not perfect. It's not trying to broadly define this term for all time, but so that applies. But beyond that, there's another issue with this interpretation that maybe makes it less predictable than we desire if we're negative. What would that problem be? Just what is wrong with the phrasing here? Yeah.
The fact that you can build things and remove them.
So that I don't think is the reason why the definition is unpredictable. That might be a reason why it's bad for debate. But those are basically different questions. On the one hand, we have, is this a reasonable thing to expect? If you were doing research and just trying to figure out the most good faith version of like, what does this term actually mean? What's predictable? That might produce outcomes that are bad for debate, but we'd be accurate. We'd be kind of precisely using our words correctly and therefore more predictably. But they might cause bad outcomes that make debate more difficult. So I would say that's probably more of a debatability thing where it means you could do one thing or do the other. But it's not necessarily a predictability thing. I'm looking for a predictability problem. Yeah.
Does the CZMA apply to the Arctic?
The coastal parts of the Arctic.
Then my answer is not.
Yeah, that's what she said. I don't think that makes it unpredictable, though, necessarily, unless you're saying it contradicts increase or something. Maybe that's the reason it's unpredictable, and I didn't even really think of that. So maybe that actually is a reason it could affect predictability. I'm still not there yet, though. Yep. Yeah, that's exactly what I was looking for. It continuously defines not development, but a development project, which is a subset of development that might have a different sort of use. And so even this card, similarly, this one has the same development project problem, but I think it's even worse. So at first glance, this card is really nice because it says, hey, look, when we're defining federal development, there are 3 different things, only one of which is federal development. Federal agency activities are the ones done by naval exercises, disposal of federal land, Army Corps of Engineers, blah, 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 improvements to a military base. All of these things are federal development. But licensing and permitting things, so if you need a license to do it, something like oil and gas or nuclear stuff, so like all the nuclear ash that are already being put out, hydroelectric dams, all of those are not topical. Federal financial assistance to state and local governments, not topical. Okay, so we're excluding things kind of clearly. But there are 2 really big issues with this card. Besides, one's related to the development project thing, but it's not exactly that. And there's another one too. Can anyone suss out what are the problems with this card that make it an inadequate definition of development? So, yes. Remember, we're trying to define its here, and we're excluding anything that's not the federal government. However, as part of the things that are federal activities, we have, quote, an oil and gas lease sale by the Mineral Management Service. So apparently you can lease stuff to the private sector, or you could dispose of hazardous waste done by a private contractor. So this seemingly includes things that we're trying to exclude, which makes it both difficult to use this workably and difficult to explain what this is even excluding or doing. So it's conceptually fraught. That's one. And then there's one other one. Is this even defining the term development project?
It's like defining federal actions generally.
Yeah, specifically it's defining activities and development projects. So who's to say which of that list is an activity and which of it is development project or both? It's not precise and it's not clear. And so it's not really defining the term in a way that maps onto the resolution perfectly. So it's still reasonable enough, and then you can kind of just read generic cards about what the word "its" means. But that's basically what most of the cards will look like. I do think there's a bunch of apps that still meet this. I included a card that had a few examples of exploration apps that meet it, but it is, useful to go back to that chart and think, what are US-only ones? Now, what are the AF answers here? So, first of all, in NEPA, which is the environmental act that establishes the environmental impact statement, the major piece of environmental protection legislation in the US, NEPA also defines a federal action. It doesn't use the word development as much, but it uses it at times. So maybe not perfect, but we are just looking for federal action. We're not even caring about development. We're caring just what is its. And so this says that a federal action is anything funded by the US. It does not include activities in which the US participates in an advisory, info gathering, or diplomatic capacity, but does not fund the action. But if it funds the action, then it's a US action. So it limits out some stuff, but not everything. And then the other card says the same thing for renewable energy, which some of the AFs kind of fall under. It's one approach. Another approach is that in practice, it is actually more difficult than it seems like to distinguish between the private sector and the government. Take this, for example. There is a role for the US private sector in developing Arctic infrastructure if given the right inducements. One promising area is satellite communication. The US military is looking into private sector efforts. The Arctic strategy should consider the role of extractive industries, all the minerals. Government offers efforts to foster infrastructure development could focus on ports, electricity, freight transportation for mineral extraction. These can be funded as cost-sharing agreements. The private sector could use the infrastructure during normal times, the military having priority during national emergencies or military exercises. So if the military builds a port, it's still the military doing its development, but if it gets funding from the private sector, does that make it not? Or even if it doesn't, but it still lets the private sector use the port when it's not using it, is that now not its development? It's kind of hard to say. You say blurry lines. And as a result, maybe prefer an interpretation that's more expansive. In practice, I would say during debates so far, the AF has been winning the majority of debates about its development. So I'm not, I think these have a role, but it's not as much as I anticipated before the topic started, to be honest. There are other interpretations at play here. There are actually the OCSLA, which is the piece of legislation we looked at when we were talking about T minerals. All of the T minerals cards also define government development. And they say a non-federal object is a federal action if it cannot continue without prior approval by a federal agency. So most of these are similar. They say permitting and all this stuff counts as its. And then you could also just read cards defining its generally. So this first card just says when we're trying to say what its means in the context of the government, if we delegate our authority by proxy to a third party, that means we're still responsible for what they do. We're still in charge of them. They're still representing us. And so it falls under the auspices of the term its. There are neg cards that go the exact opposite way. But, again, these are kind of just generic cards. I don't know. To me, this argument that infrastructure development is just often done with the private sector in other countries makes it kind of difficult to win. And then you could just say its means US funding. And so as long as we're funding the activities, we offer it to other countries. If they get involved, so be it. If not, we still do it by ourselves. That's basically a recipe for a winning F. The most successful neg its definitions I've seen have been if you're trying to create development for competition for a private sector or privatization counterplan, you could say its means US funded activities. So if we don't provide any funding, it can't be its. So I think funding is probably the best interpretation overall. But I don't know. I obviously don't love either of these sets of T definitions because none of these terms map very well onto this topic. You could probably already see the difference between the terms in last year's topic and the terms in this one. Really, everything in last year's topic was kind of a package deal. Like the whole idea of strengthening protection is something that's actually measured. There are so many different ways that people literally spent their lives compiling databases to measure patent protection in different countries. We had IPR, which actually was, along with trade secrets, the other 3 areas. Here, we're really just doing our best to make do with a bad situation. And you might think that might not cause topicality debates. So far, there's actually been quite a few. And that's because if there's no good topicality argument, it just becomes harder to debate substantially. And you have a strong incentive to create as good as one as you can, because your opponents won't be very good either. And so it's a relatively equal debate. So a lot of counterplans and T debates will come down to these questions. It might seem technical and boring, but it's very important to start thinking about them. And you'll basically be grappling with these and similar definitional cards all year long. So I'm going to go on to a survey of kind of what I anticipate the F and neg round on this topic is like. Does anyone have any questions before I do that? Okay. For Fs, we can initially set up what are cases that meet T minerals. And so far there's maybe 6. 2 of these we're going to put out in the next wave. None of these Fs are out yet. So the Department of the Interior, the Bureau for Land Management or the Bureau for Water Management, they lease private sector development, which means if you're a company, you apply for a permit, you then basically try to not buy the land, but lease the land. Basically, you rent it. And then you also need a permit to extract stuff and sell it from the land. A lot of the areas of northern Alaska, probably should have included a map here. We'll go all the way back. So the areas right here, this entire area is basically one of the world's largest wildlife refuges in the world. It's known as ANWR, ANWR, but people say ANWR, the Alaska National Wildlife Refuge. And it is actually some of the most commercially viable mineral potential of all of Alaska, but it is also one of the most important biodiversity hotspots. And during the Bush administration and the early Obama administration, one of the actually highest profile political controversies that at a national stage ever enveloped the Arctic was whether or not we should lease out ANWR to mineral leasing. And we basically didn't. Trump kind of wants to and has started, but hasn't fully finished it. That's a potential F. It is kind of tough to make just a pure oil or natural gas F. And that is because, number one, you really can't make a huge dent in global production through just Alaska, even if you opened up ANWR. And even if you did, there's no specific reason why Alaska would be key. So sure, we have more cheap natural gas, but that doesn't give a reason why it needs to be in Alaska. Maybe we shouldn't do it in Alaska because that's bad for Russia's economy, and we can instead do it literally anywhere else in the entire world as a counterplan. That is a difficult type of strategy to answer. I didn't put it here. I'm not putting it in. Seabed mining is a huge potential one. This one has more of an Arctic key warrant because there's minerals that are likely extractable in the Arctic and are present in huge densities there that they aren't elsewhere, all of our zinc and palladium, all of our mineral friends. The seabed is just the ocean floor, and you'd have to obviously have an entire underwater structure that was able to drill it. And beyond that, one of the biggest controversies in the Arctic is who has rights to what parts of the seabed. I mean, it's actually very difficult to say. So Russia claims all the way to the North Pole, and then they actually have wildly different ways of measuring underground what constitutes the seabed. And even if they measure it one way, it's really easy to cheat. Let's say we're just drilling under the ground, and we've drilled into the seabed. Once you go underground, you can just kind of turn and start going underground into what's then under your rival's territory, technically. And the legal framework for governing this in the oceans is the Law of the Sea Treaty, often called LOS, or UNCLOS, the United Nations Convention on Law of the Sea. And the United States is actually not a signatory to LOS. We haven't signed it. That being said, nearly every other country in the world has. And so when there's a legal dispute internationally between countries, we actually do still go to the UN's Law of the Sea tribunals for adjudication on this. Now, if we maybe made a little bit more of a clear legal framework and then started actually supporting development activities, seabed mining could be a very credible AF. It's similar to REM mining, but obviously emphasizes the governance aspect of it. And I'm writing this AF right now for my lab. I actually think it's pretty good. Another AF that Eric Forrest is writing for my lab is just infrastructure for pipelines. So pipelines cover natural gas or oil extraction, and they literally are exactly what they sound like. They're a giant pipe that could be above or below ground that enables the transportation of minerals and resources. It is obviously very difficult to extract stuff from a world where there's no roads. You're not going to ship the stuff in a plane. And so in order for stuff to be logistically or commercially feasible, you need to have a pipeline there. REM mining, so this one's kind of interesting too. There's actually a big role in governmental exploration and mapping before the commercial sector would be able to even extract rare earth minerals. There's some cards that are like, unless NOAA says this amount of minerals exists here and we can certify that we'll defend it's in the US's territory, companies wouldn't bother with the high startup cost of mining for rare earth minerals that are only found in the Arctic. And so kind of an exploration version of that is viable. There are other resources. Offshore wind is another one of them. The Arctic might be particularly good for that. And then we could potentially even go into other countries. I know one of the juniors labs has been running since the beginning of the camp a mining development AF that basically sets up a legal infrastructure for the US to commercially mine in Greenland. And so these, I think, are the major key minerals cases. There's a few energy cases that get adjacent to these. So we've already talked a little bit about nuclear SMRs and floating SMRs. We've talked a little bit about geoengineering. So that's like 4 camp AFs already. Methane hydrates is another AF area. So a methane hydrate is a specific type of natural gas formation that's found in these dense clusters under the ocean. They're important for 2 reasons. Number one, they really only exist in huge capacities at the poles. And number 2, some people believe that there might be what they often call a methane bomb, such that if global warming hits a certain level, these hydrates might cause an independent positive feedback loop that releases a huge amount of methane into the oceans, acidifying them beyond redemption. And so actually mining them and gradually taking out the oil at a slow trickle, the oil and natural gas at a slow trickle, not only is economically beneficial, it would prevent this Arctic-specific climate catastrophe from happening, independent of broader global warming. And so this AF, I guarantee, will be written and read, although no camp has taken it up yet. And then there's a lot of environment apps that do sensors, environment observation. Georgetown put out a space AF for their starter pack. Honestly, not super clear if it was military or commercial or both, or civilian or both. But in past topics, this has been a little bit more common than it is now. I will say I think one of the reasons people have gotten lower on these AFs is that just getting data about something, unless there's really actionable things you can do with it commercially or militarily, most people don't believe, like, say, more data will persuade global decision makers to actually believe warming is real and do something about it, which historically has been one of the huge advantages to AFs about data collection in the Arctic. By far the most popular AFs have been military AFs. They can do any or all of these things. and they can have side advantages, especially based on all the different side quests, like fishing management, oil spill preparedness that the Coast Guard does. But their core advantages are typically to deter Chinese and Russian incursions into the Arctic and to establish, if not US dominance, at least a sufficient US presence in those regions to prevent our rivals from being the sole beneficiary of their resources. Depending on how aggressive you believe Russia or China are, perhaps you believe that if we're insufficiently well preserved in the Arctic, we are destined to lose a conflict there. We would open ourselves up to even an attack. Okay, so what does the Arctic military AF do? I mean, I probably got like 7 emails for the same question for the logistics AF. What does the logistics AF do? It can do any or all of these things. The most important is that, okay, so with kind of the thawing permafrost, the melting glaciers, a lot of people are like, oh, that's great for the Arctic, right? It'll open up all of this new area that you can sail through. It'll make the land a lot more livable. That's kind of true, but remember, like, even though these places are pretty empty, they're not completely empty. They already have, to some extent, roads and ports and infrastructure. And if the permafrost melts, that actually destroys all of it. You need to completely refurbish, kind of from the ground up. And so you need to repair deep sea ports. You need to build new runways. You need to basically build all types of new military installations. Now, if you are a big military hawk, you're a DoD writer begging for funds in the Arctic, what is kind of like your dream wish list? What do you think the Arctic should be a staging ground for? Well, the Arctic would be very good at staging one of the legs of the nuclear triad. We could have long-range bombers because the Arctic is super close and convenient way to get to Russia. The Arctic is a very convenient place to put satellites, especially tethered satellites that basically stay in a locked orbital position right above the Arctic. That has a vantage point that accesses the entire North Pole and can teach us a lot about what our adversaries are doing. Some people say we should establish underwater drones. The biggest thing militarily that an underwater drone could do is detect enemy subs. This is something that I guarantee you will have debates about this year. It's probably one of the more important military applications. I'll just go on a quick kind of overview on why that's important. Okay, does anyone know what are the 3 legs of the nuclear triad? What does that even mean? Yep.
What are they? The land-based missiles, submarines, and bombs.
Right. So, and what is that? What is the nuclear triad? Like what for what?
It basically ensures that we have nuclear capabilities at all times. Once compromised,
Right. So the idea, obviously, we have nuclear weapons, and not only do we have them, we have the capacity to use them at any moment. So if you were Russia and you're like, well, the U.S. can destroy us, but if we took out their nukes first, then they never would be able to destroy us, and we could just take it all out. That's often called a bolt from a blue attack. We deter that by constantly having. There are a bunch of planes that are flying around right now with nuclear weapons. There are thousands of U.S. naval servicemen in submarines right now. I mean, they have to spend months at a time there just traveling around close enough to potentially bomb Russia. And we have, of course, back in the U.S., these really deep, 200-meter deep pits in which we have silos that can launch intercontinental ballistic missiles. Okay, so we have all of those. Of those 3, what is by far the most threatening to an opponent? Shout it out if you want to guess. Why? Yes. The ocean is actually just, we know less about the ocean at any given moment than we do about the surface of the moon or Mars. And it is just a very basic visibility issue. The ocean, because it has lots and lots of water that makes actually detecting anything via any sensory information impossible, means that we, even with all the technology today, really have no idea where our enemy subs are at any given moment. One of the only things that could patch this, kind of like our best guess right now, is an underwater drone. And so a big decision for an AF to make is, do you find the ability to detect enemy subs? Why does this matter? Well, if you are currently under the impression that no one could bolt from the blue first strike you. You're safe from that because they're deterred as a result of your ability to bomb them with your secret hidden subs at any given moment. Then, you're kind of happy, but then you believe all of a sudden there's these drones that can find your subs and take them out. Now you're at risk. Now things are potentially going to get a little hairy. Or alternatively, if you can execute this effectively, we could mean if there was ever any US-Russia war, if we could find their subs, we could just automatically escalate, take all of their stuff down in one fell swoop, execute an effective and overwhelming counterstrike or counterforce strike, and they're done. So from the military perspective, if we did this, we have what's called a survivable nuclear arsenal. But from the adversary perspective, it's a huge risk. And so you can see both the advantage and the DA there. And then maybe you can put seafloor monitoring stuff as well. So those are the big things the military could do. There's maybe two other specific AF applications. The first is there's this military base called ADAC that's on the Aleutian Islands. And a lot of people believe that ADAC is very well poised to serve as a launching point for both planes and vessels in the event of an overseas attack by the Russians. And so there's another weird application to ADAC that makes it a popular AF idea that has nothing to do with the military at all, which is that ADAC could be a potential location for the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. And this is just popular because it gives you an advantage that other AFs don't have, and it has nothing to do with a lot of the Arctic stuff. The SPR is pretty much what it sounds like. It's a giant reserve. It's a huge set of warehouses and underground storage pits that has millions of barrels of oil, such that if there were an oil shock, let's say the Iran war escalated further and Iran chose to close the Strait of Hormuz when we attacked them, we could survive the hit to global oil prices by releasing these and selling them to the commercial sector. So just having lots of spare oil capacity. And having it in the Arctic gives a geographic kind of safe spot where all the events that are likely to close down ports and shipping lanes in the Middle East would not be blocked. And so we actually wouldn't be able to access SPR sale. We would be able to sell to Asia. We would be able to kind of keep a globalized oil supply running other than a Pacific port. Other military things, ballistic missile defense. So we have two major missile defense systems in the US, but one of them, the GMD, it is mainly located exclusively in Alaska. BMD is another element in strategic stability. So whether or not an AF improves BMD is important. BMD is basically what it sounds like. It's ballistic missile defense. So a ballistic missile is one that uses a physical trajectory of purely gravitational and basically operating via physical constraints. It does not get guided, has no steering whatsoever. It just kind of launches and uses the physics of the Earth to go down to alter its route. From Russia, the way an intercontinental ballistic missile would work, it would actually just go into space for a few seconds and then drop back down. And missile defense is basically trying to shoot that bullet with another bullet. It would attempt to actually shoot it out of the air. And we would test it, and we would deploy it. And if it actually worked, Russia would see those tests, and they would be basically deterred from ever even attempting to launch in the first place. They would know that they would really not be able to stand a chance in a war with us. So most missile defense against Russia would have to be in the Arctic by geographical necessity. Otherwise, the Arctic would be the pathway. Really everything but terminal phase, which is the part that would be maybe over a US city or military base in the US proper, would have to be in the US, and terminal missile defense is the worst. Usually, if you have missile defense, you want it to be in the mid-course when it's in space. And so better Alaskan missile defense could similarly deter Russia. Domain awareness, just kind of the buzzword that a lot of these AFs use. Exactly what it means is not clear. It could mean anything from knowing where our enemy subs are, knowing how our enemy's missile defense operations work, or just knowing more about the area in general. And so by itself, domain awareness is not a term that has all that much meaning, but it does have very specific meaning depending on how it's used. Pretty much every military app is going to have a bunch of cards that reference domain awareness. So the last military area app that's important to go through is icebreakers, which the camp has not really turned out. The Coast Guard presently has only 3 icebreakers. Of those 3, only 2 of them work, and they have to serve both the Arctic and the Antarctic. And of those 2, only one of them can even break 20 feet of ice. So the Coast Guard is not very good at icebreaking, and there's basically an icebreaker class above the icebreakers we have called an ice-strengthened surface ship, which is basically a ship that can actually move cargo on this ice and break it as well. So in the big, beautiful bill that just passed, we allegedly are going to fund 40 icebreakers, which is like a number Trump was obsessed with both in his first term and now. Even our biggest rivals only have icebreakers numbering in the 30s. As you can see, every one of those dots is an icebreaker. That the red ones are Russia. And it's unclear what we would even do with that. The Coast Guard says that they need maybe 8 to 10. I liked this tweet. Maybe he's using the number 40 in a biblical way when 40 days and 40 nights is like a euphemism for a lot. But there's a lot of strategy to an icebreakers app even still. So number one, the icebreakers that we're building are still not ice-strengthened surface ships. They're kind of the smaller icebreakers. And number two, we've actually had plans to build icebreakers for years and years and years, but they just never come to fruition. So there's similarly plans to lease icebreakers from Canada or Finland. The classic way to write the icebreakers app is to say, status quo means we're going to lease these from our rivals, but that doesn't allow US shipbuilding industry to rebuild itself and make itself like a naval powerhouse for building ships. And so that triggers ideas, but not the advantage. That version's harder to read now because we do have actual formal plans and funding for these 40 icebreakers, even though most people are skeptical they actually get built. To be honest, in my opinion, the icebreakers argument for the US is kind of weak. It's like based off of old, like basically it's like an argument from 20 years ago that just gotten recycled but does not match the current realities. The two icebreaker powerhouses of the world, like the places that actually have the shipyards to build these, are Finland and Russia. If you wanted to get an icebreaker, you would probably go there. Given that Finland is our ally and in NATO with us, it doesn't make a lot of sense to basically build an entirely new shipbuilding industry for a type of ship that a rival already produces when we could instead build things that only we could produce, especially Aegis cruisers and the like, and then build those for ourselves and allies alike. So, I don't know, I think that there will be really annoying icebreakers apps out there because this app is very borderline non-inherent, both because we have plans to lease and because we have plans to build our own. But people have little criticisms and problems with those plans, and so you can have an app that minimally distinguishes itself from the status quo. And it's also worth noting that in terms of like a big problem with our ability to access the Arctic, a common thing you'll see in card after card, and then a common 1 in C case argument you'll see against apps that don't do icebreakers is that we don't have enough icebreakers, and so we can't solve or get through the Arctic efficiently. This covers what icebreakers we have. The US is attempting to build now medium icebreakers and light icebreakers, so still don't have any plans to build year-round operations. The solid red dots are ones that represent actual icebreakers in the field. Other AF mechanisms or AF ideas. We have space-based climate modeling, kind of mentioned that one. An interesting one is extending US OCS claims into the Arctic. So remember we said it's not clear exactly what constitutes the US's exclusive economic zone in the Arctic. Russia also is unclear. We could just basically say we're expanding development of the Arctic by exploring the seabed and figuring out exactly what is the Arctic, and then legally claiming other areas for it. And so we could use this as a pivot against Russia. We can set it up for mineral rights. There's a couple of advocates for that, bless you. We could do drones or the data the drones produces, but not for military purposes, but purely for exploratory purposes. I feel like this is probably more of a mineral exploration AF idea than it is anything else, but maybe there's another purpose. An AF that is allegedly being written, but I'm not sure if it's getting turned out, is undersea cables. So there's obviously been, ever since the telegraph was connected across the Atlantic, a huge amount of electronic telecommunications infrastructure that literally goes in a cable underneath the ocean. In the Arctic, potentially communications infrastructures could be made more resilient if we had undersea cables in the Arctic area. And then, I mean, I think some of the advocates for these projects kind of see this whole new Arctic communication sphere connecting the world in like an, I don't know, like some economic way. It's weird though, because just in terms of distance, it makes very little sense to link things through the Arctic. Like we already have links to Japan and China through the Pacific and to Europe through the Atlantic. And the Arctic is just so like cold and barren that it's harder to have resilient infrastructure there. So I don't know exactly what this AF would do, but I mean, there could be some, or I don't know why it's like a great idea, but I'm sure there's probably some advantage out there. Maybe the other ones are at risk of being under attack, and resilient ones here would preserve communications in the event of a crisis. A classic AF idea that has been run in the past is almost kind of like a, not a KAF, but like a more, like a less traditionally advantaged AF with the plan is cooperate with Russia and create a global cooperative effort to link the world together through building a bridge or tunnel to Russia. If you look back at those maps of the Arctic, and a lot of you who probably thought this to yourself at one point or another in your life, you know, you can't travel from Russia to the US despite the fact that there are you know, at most 20 miles, and then during the winter, only ice that you can walk on separating the two countries. And so building a bridge might be a way to reinvigorate either US-Russian cooperation or signal something more globally cosmopolitan and morally desirable. And then there, I didn't list these because the slide got cut off at the bottom, but there are a lot of consultative mechanisms or soft left AFs for indigenous populations. And that is a very popular AF so far as well. Last area is cooperation AF mechanisms. We've already turned out Russia cooperation and India cooperation AFs. India is not an Arctic country, but you could still invite to the Arctic to do stuff with you there. Russia is the most common one, and to me the one that makes the most sense because you have both an exploration-ish AF and a military development-ish AF. And this is based off of an actual structural barrier to cooperation with Russia in the Arctic now. So in the early Obama administration, 2010, Obama very optimistically believed that we might have the ability to reset our relationship with Russia. And we could, you know, this being 15, 20 years after the end of the Cold War, completely change our approach to Russia, make them into an ally. There was even talk of inviting Russia into NATO at one point. Obviously, this did not go very well. Their invasion first of Georgia and then in 2014 of Ukraine basically proved that Russia was not going to adhere to our vision of the liberal world order, and it made the reset seem like a complete failure. In the wake of that, late in Obama's last term, he actually banned something that was happening much more commonly early on when he was president, military-to-military cooperation between the US and Russia. Non-military parts of their coast guards can cooperate, especially under multilateral regimes like the UN, but there is no actual security cooperation between those two countries. And so if you are like somebody who thinks even if Russia is a bad country doing bad stuff, it doesn't make sense to antagonize them, A, because even if they're not great, it's much worse if they ally with our biggest, just structural geopolitical rival in terms of China, and B, because as bad as they are, they're not all that big of a threat. I mean, the Russian economy is smaller than the economies of both California and Texas. They're not a top 10 world population. They're have way too much ground to defend. They basically only have a few crazy asymmetric abilities like nuclear weapons and cyber attacks, and very little else. And so spending a lot of time and thought and money on dealing with Russia when they could be allies that don't pose a major threat is important. And so we could start small, build kind of cooperative trust mechanisms between our militaries through just military-to-military co-op of any sort in the Arctic. Also, even if we didn't do military co-op, they are basically excluded from the Arctic Council as well. And so perhaps we could do basic research and exploration activities with them, which is the thesis of the Starter Pack Science Diplomacy AF. And so already there are two pretty popular cooperate with Russia AFs, and I think you'll see this throughout the year. How are we feeling? We're looking a little dead. We don't have a ton of time left. Do we need 5 minutes and we'll do a last 10 on this, or we want to power straight through? All right, but we're gonna, if you're not back, I'm gonna restart. We're gonna take a tight 5-minute break and then conclude. It just depends what you do. The bigger decision is, do you do missile defense or sub-detection? And you actually could do them with either. So whether or not you do those things is really the big determinant of whether or not you link to StratStab.
I guess I feel like I don't really understand what logistics infrastructure is. Is it just about moving supplies around, or does that include BMDs and stuff?
Well, it includes ports and air and basically all the facilities and also the personnel and troops that you would need to do these things. And that actually in turn would enable sensors and BMD because you need to have them in a lot of places that we don't have logistical access to now. And so, yeah, and it's just actually all of the infrastructure that supports the military.
Okay, so the logistics app basically assumes that our current capabilities are sufficient to deter Russia and China as long as we strategically locate them?
No, current infrastructure is not there. We actually just need a bigger military presence in Alaska.
Just like a Russia cooperation app, for instance, instead of doing the seepage in an exploration way, would you just make the app target towards exploring a certain thing in the Arctic, you think? Or how would you do that and make an exploration cooperation app?
Probably mapping or charting.
Mapping or charting. Okay, no, that makes sense. Thank you.
These slides would be accessible to us at the end of the
Yeah. Okay. Just 10 minutes left. You're doing great. We're so close. Okay. So we have an idea of what the Fs can say. What can the negs say? Okay, maybe something, but unfortunately, this topic is not the greatest for neg grounds. In the last couple of weeks alone, what has the US done? Well, we officially built 16 new icebreakers and 22 new cutters, so depending if you count those as icebreakers, 40. 300 million in new port infrastructure, 150 million for especially a new missile defense project in Alaska called the Golden Dome, which actually solves a lot of the things you'd want to describe for the missile defense stuff. Exploration of existing Arctic infrastructure, reopening the Naval Air Station at ADAC, all of which sounds like it makes the Fs non-inherent. Unfortunately, if you have a problem with current icebreakers or current missile defense or the way that we're setting up ADAC right now, most of the Fs are like, we're doing this, but we're doing this in an inadequate way that triggers your DAs but doesn't solve our advantages. And all these other things trigger exploration and development. And so if you go for most topic DAs, depending on what your link is, you will see many, many teams with 1NCs at the very top of the DA shell that have like a uniqueness counterplan. Like let's say you're going for missile defense bad, you're probably going to want to have a counterplan plank that bans the Golden Dome, because otherwise the status quo triggers all of your links. So it is important to keep in mind that you can ban exploration and development activities to establish link uniqueness for your DAs, but you kind of need to do that because in truth, most DAs have issues with uniqueness. So we're going to go over counterplans and DAs. I will prove this to you on the next slide, but the Alaska counterplan is actually threatening. Alaska as a state has a lot of power and levers to pull in the Arctic. And even though there are many agencies you could use, unlike last year's topic, the politics DA actually kind of links to every F. And that is because both exploration and development require funding, which requires going through Congress. And so having a state do something that doesn't require going through Congress could avoid politics and serve as actually a decent generic strategy. We could have international actor counterplans. Remember, we are NATO allies with 6 of the Arctic countries. We are NATO allies, we are military allies with all of them. We are in the Arctic Council with all of them. And so a lot of times when the US and other countries make the military decisions in the Arctic, they do so collaboratively. And all of these countries have much more at stake in the Arctic than we do. Like the US, to be honest, there's just geographically and geopolitically so much going on here that the Arctic is kind of an afterthought in our politics. For every other country, the Arctic is a much more essential part of their identity, economy, military, everything. And so they just care a lot more. And given that our interests are often the same, we generally, especially if they're willing to foot the bill for it and fund it, will just do what they want as long as it's reasonable. And so Canada initiating action or the EU, if it's theoretically legitimate, is a threatening counterplan concept. Depending on how you define the term "it's," you could even have the Arctic Council just do the plan, or the Canada, or basically cooperative efforts like NATO do the plan. And then you could also have private sectors development, especially for pretty much everything not military. You could say, we're going to devolve all the authority to do this, mining and drilling to the private sector, no leasing or permitting required. And so it's all of their development, but the US government sets it up with a counterplan. Just one insane card with the Alaska counterplan. This is just from this crazy article in the Anchorage Daily News. Okay, you'd think, okay, sure, Alaska can fund a lot of stuff, but can it fund the military? Apparently, Alaskans can put up land, build new facilities, provide the Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, Coast Guards, each new bases. Alaska can save the federal government billions. We can finance the facilities with tax-exempt bonds and provide leases to each branch of the military. These all build state buildings. When I was with the Atlanta State Housing Authority, where does the construction money come from? Lease-back bond funding. We provide cash. Literally just give it out to the military bases. And so we can fund it. We just give them all these free bases. They'll probably say yes. Doesn't involve Congress because there's no funding, avoids politics, but solves the F. Threatening strategy. DAs, DAs definitely exist on this topic, and the best DA links will usually be rooted in what the AF claims. So if you deter Russia or China, automatically you have a link to Russian politics, which has been a very popular DA. In our lab's internal tournament, 42% of the 2NRs were Russian politics. Russia, the idea is that elites and the military who are key to supporting Putin would see the plan as ensuring a Russian loss of face or loss of military capacity, which means they would not support him, and Putin goes down swinging and lashes out as he's attempting to desperately cling to a hope of surviving. Strategic stability is another huge DA. This is kind of the one we were talking about earlier. If you do missile defense or subdetection, if you're Russia and you're like, well, previously the US could never take me out entirely, now they can, you have maybe from a military perspective, you have an incentive to strike the US before the US can totally take you out. Then at least you have a chance in the future. And maybe you think you can win or de-escalate it quickly, the same way we guessed when we bombed Iran that they wouldn't respond, we would get what we wanted, and it wouldn't escalate. They would think the same thing, but that's not the case. We would respond accidentally, they'd get us all into a nuclear war. Containment is usually paired with its opposite, engagement. When we contain a country, we see them as a threat, and we want to not work with them and prevent them from getting stronger. This is sometimes called encirclement as well. Same idea, you're kind of getting around them and keeping them. This could cause Russia to lash out with us. And, as the Russia Relations DA says, it would cause them to stop cooperating with us, especially on some of the most important areas of mutual agreement, like arms control. Despite the fact that the US and Russia were at the height of the Cold War, one fact to keep in mind is that even enemies could cooperate with one another on areas of mutual interest. For arms control, from the 1970s to the 1980s, despite the fact that the US and Russia were not at all friends, this is still the height of the Cold War, the combination of the early SALT, S-A-L-T, and START treaties, these are acronyms, meant that the total number of nuclear warheads in the world went from a peak of 60,000 to just 15 years later, a third of that at 20,000. Literally, through cooperation on arms control, the US and Russia at the height of the Cold War each agreed that we just had way too many nukes that we didn't need but did threaten the globe if there was ever a nuclear war, and we dismantled 2/3 of our arsenal, both of us. And so continuing arms control is still very important, cutting off Russia, and basically the be mean to Russia set of Fs you can kind of read any of these against. Against Russia cooperation, you basically say the opposite of arguments. So Russia politics could also be read against this. This is usually more of like a public-focused argument that the reason why Putin has support in Russia is because he is basically built this entire anti-Western persona, and so it would undermine the reason why he has public support if he just cooperated with the West again. Often described as anytime you're conciliatory towards an aggressive rival, we have appeasement. And the idea here is that if we give Russia a little bit, give them an inch, they take a mile, and it'll encourage them to start being aggressive, not only more so in Ukraine, but around the world as well. Our NATO allies who hate Russia and are scared of them would be appalled if we cooperated with them. And the Arctic Council, which basically sees the US and the Arctic Council countries as all cooperating as the kind of core foundation of science diplomacy, they would be upset if we just bilaterally cut them out of the equation and did so with Russia and not included them. And so that's a potential DA as well. You could say that there's Indo-Pacific trade-off. A common argument is that we basically would put way too many resources into the Arctic and not into China. And there's a bunch of generic things besides that. Obviously politics. You can say it trades off with other countries' leadership. Both Canada and soft power have been put out. Against minerals Fs, these files really aren't out, but you could write oil DAs, and I bet you'll see that. And then, of course, you have generic impact turns and Ks, which sometimes have better or worse application. Sorry I had to speed through these last couple of slides, but I wanted to make sure you were able to get to lunch in time. That will conclude the topic lecture. You'll have your lab assignments in an email ASAP if you don't already, and I hope you have a great time here at the Michigan Institute.